Okay, hi, thanks everyone for attending. I'm speaking today about advanced front-end architecture in Sass Gulp and how to use living style guides in Drupal projects. My name is A.J. Foster and my company is Foster Interactive, and I am F Interactive on Twitter. My team is a front-end team focused on building pretty complex user interfaces in a way that's sustainable and maintainable across our projects. We love working with other teams, dev shops, and in-house marketing folks. Also, I'm a board member on the Toronto Drupal user group. Yay! My company is the website sponsor for this event, so we put together the Drupal North website, and I've also founded the Sass Toronto meetup, where we do a bunch of front-end Sass hacking kind of stuff outside of the Drupal world specifically. So for better or for worse, front-end development is getting really complicated, and it's kind of difficult to plan out and map what we're going to be doing when we build front-end websites. We have a number of challenges to face when we're building front-end sites. We need to make sure that our layouts accommodate a wide range of screens and devices and different capabilities. So we're building with responsive design. That's sort of been the default for a couple of years now. We also need to make sure that everything runs really fast, so we need to worry about optimization a lot. And we also, what I find is the websites are getting more and more complicated. It becomes more of an issue of sustainability in the websites that we're building. So we need to make sure that how we build our websites are able to accommodate change and growth over time as those websites evolve. And maybe a year in the future, a new device or something comes out, we've got to be able to support those new devices without redoing everything on our site. So this is the main problem I've been finding, is actually as the websites get more and more complicated, it becomes more and more difficult we'd end up forgetting pieces of the website and the interface that we actually create. And that problem is further compounded than when you start working on a larger project. Obviously, you're probably going to start working across a team of people who are all doing front-end development, and you need to be able to communicate what something you built 6 months ago to someone else who's now on your team who started on the project and is now working on the same item. So we end up with this problem where that new person might make a whole new user interface widget that's pretty much the same as whatever you built 6 months ago, wasting time and money and actually making your website far more difficult to maintain, because now you've got two separate code bases, which is bad. So we put together a little project called Mainspring.io. It's kind of like a front-end starter kit that we use as our starting projects for our Drupal websites. It is not a theme. It is a bunch of tools and packages assembled from outside of the Drupal universe that we basically, we learn about something cool and interesting, we try it out in our project. If it's good, it makes it into Mainspring, and that's just where we start off. So really there's a couple different components that come into Mainspring, really like 3 different pieces. A whole bunch of Gulp and or node tasks, and we'd use these to automate stuff. A Sass and CSS architecture that's very highly opinionated, sort of based off of the Drupal D8 CSS architecture, but we refine it a little bit. And then finally, a system for generating a living style guide, which is a really useful tool to be using on all of your projects. And so we just sort of bundle these pieces together to make sure that we start off all of our projects in sort of a similar way. So we end up with this kind of crazy machine of all these different peak tools working together. And for our rules of thumb, if it's usable on 80% of our projects, it's worthy of going into Mainspring. And with maybe a few exceptions, if something doesn't generate any file bloat to your end project, then we might put in a few other tools that we use as well. So as I'm presenting this, you may get the impression that we're building the world's most complicated machine to render CSS. So Rube Goldberg is this guy who came up with this concept of those crazy machines that do simple things through very complicated ways. So if you have that impression, that's okay, each to their own. But really, part of the motivation for making Mainspring as well was that as we were trying to learn as a team how to use these tools, so like how to do Sass structure and how to do Gulp and that kind of thing, it was really hard to find examples where all those pieces were put together in one place. You'd find a blog post on how to do one Gulp task, and then you find a different blog post on how to do partial naming or something. So even if you don't feel that this is appropriate for your projects, It's an MIT open source licensed project, so you can go and look at a piece, take that piece out and pop it into your project. So you don't need to sort of take everything together. So how do we install Mainspring? Well, you go and use Drupal console because you're going to generate probably a vanilla theme from scratch. That's what we like to do. And I like to use stable as our base theme because it's basically got absolutely nothing in it. And that's where we want to start from a theming level so that we don't have a bunch of assumptions that are already in there. And it frees us to use our own sort of architectural methods. Next thing is if you check out Mainspring, which is up on GitHub, foster/Mainspring, you actually want to download the zip of the project because basically you're just going to use this as a starting point, or maybe even like as a demo project to play around in. And if you git clone it, you'll never want to re-update Mainspring back from its core ever again. You just want to fork it and go off and modify it as you see fit. Maybe some point in the future, this might become a human template, which would probably be like a little bit more sophisticated. So you run a command line and maybe select a few options to configure it with as you run into your projects. Next step, just go to wherever it was you made that theme, and then you unzip Mainspring inside of there. Just do npm install. So all the tools that are in this project now run in Node. Previous iterations of this had some Ruby stuff, some Node stuff, and whatever, and that was kind of crazy to install. So we've simplified it, and it's now 100% Node. That install process will probably take 5 or 10 minutes because it's downloading tons and tons of crap. And then run Gulp Bower. So this is a Gulp task that uses Bower, which I'll talk about in a second, to just go and download like jQuery and some front-end JavaScript tools we like to use and some Sass tools we like to use. And when you install this, do not worry about warnings. It says, warning, this package is out of date, blah, blah, blah. That's going to happen 1,000 times. As long as it doesn't say error something, it's all good. Last thing is you need to go into the Gulp, inside of that folder, there's a Gulp.js folder with a config.js folder in it. And really, there's only 2 things you have to actually configure to get this working. The first is to point the local URL of your development environment. And then the second is to identify some JavaScript files. If you have JavaScript files that you want to have show up in your generated style guide, you put them in that script's style guide extra head folder. So let's talk a little bit about the Gulp tasks that are in there. Basically, the architecture for Gulp inside of this project is set up so that each task is broken out in its own discrete file, so make it easier to copy and paste out into other projects. All the configuration for all of the tasks is centralized into Gulp.js config.js folder, so you can basically, there's a bunch of, there's those 2 mandatory ones, but a bunch of optional configuration options that are in there. And then if you want to actually see how the tasks work, look in the task folder. And that's all inside of there. So let's take a look at the first task. It was the last step of the installation, Gulp Bower. What that's actually doing is there's a bower.json file, which is a manifest list of all the little packages, JavaScript and CSS you want to install. It actually runs Bower, which is a Node module inside of Gulp, downloads those files into Bower Components. So that's what Bower does by default. Then we look for the JavaScript files that are inside of there, the unminified JavaScript files that are the core project ones, copies them into js/vendor folder, and then makes another copy of them that is minified inside of the same folder. So why are we doing this? Basically, sometimes it's nice to have the unminified source file when you need to debug, when you're working through a project, but most of the time, especially in your Drupal settings, you're going to be including the minified files inside of there. So this is a really simple Gulp task that's just sort of a utility function to get you going. If you wanted to change what packages you're using in your project, go ahead and update bower.json and rerun Gulp Bower. Another really simple example, if you run Gulp images, so this is an image optimization technique that is lossless. What this does is it looks for your /image source folder and then finds all the files that are in there, compresses them losslessly using ImageMin, and then nags at you if the files are too big. So there's a configurable, I think it's 70K or something like that, and you're like, if an image is more than 70K, you probably have a problem. And so this is just an example of, and then outputs them to the images folder. So there's sort of like a source folder and an output folder. and just another little way to help remember not to have giant loaded images in your project. SassLint is another tool that's integrated through the Gulp stack. SassLint is awesome. It is kind of like a strict parent that enforces coding conventions across your team. So this is not valid Sass syntax. This is like obsessive, detailed specs for you and your whole team about exactly how you should be formatting your Sass. And the reason why you want to be obsessive and crazy about it is that over time, your Sass kind of changes, and between projects it kind of changes. So it takes more time to get used to your own old work that's like a year old. And so now if you're working on multiple people in different parts of a project, then you'll see like one part of the project has pretty different syntax and sort of structure than another. So here's an example inside of here. This is SassLint inside of Sublime text editor. So it actually has like plugins for many text editors. And you can see where it's highlighting a bunch of things in yellow that it's not happy about. And so, for example, the first one, it wants a space between the declaration and the curly brackets. And if at the same time this is all running in console, so if you run the Gulp task, it's actually going to start complaining about all the little syntax problems in your files and tell you exactly how to fix them. And in the case of even C-button big, it's complaining that that class name is not adhering to the standard class naming pattern that we've defined in the SassLint configuration file, which is the .sass-lint.yaml file in the root. So similar to SassLint, there's a JSLint function in there. And basically when you run JSLint, it goes ahead and looks in the JS folder for any JavaScript files. But then it needs to go through a step because in the Bower install, we installed a bunch of third-party packages and there's no chance that they're going to line up with our coding conventions. So it filters out whatever the heck's in vendor, and it also filters out anything that's minified from what it decides to lint. And then it nags at you for things like spaces and all the rest of that. So we're doing a lot of Sass work, right? And this sort of goal of making many small files. Those small files are in Sass partials, and each small file should be small enough for a front-end person to sort of look at the file and understand it all as one discrete piece, and then all of that gets compiled by Sass into one big machine-friendly, highly optimized output file. So, developer-friendly partials, machine-friendly output. We want to make a huge complex project and break it down into small chunks so we can understand it. Also lets multiple developers work on different parts of files at the same time in a version control system and not have as many conflicts. So this is the Gulp task for compiling CSS. There's actually two in there. I'm just going to run through the dev one. There's Gulp CSS dev and Gulp CSS prod, just whether it minifies whether it's optimizing the output. But we'll take a look at the dev stack first. So it looks inside of the SCSS folder and looks for every Sass file that's in there. First thing it does is generate some source maps. So because we've got many source files getting compiled into one optimized output file, source maps is a tool that lets your browser's inspector understand the relationship between which source file generated the output. So when you have a source map working, then you can inspect the output of something in your website and then see which Sass partial actually generated that piece. So say you want to change the color of a button, inspect the button, and then because of source maps, the inspector will be able to tell you which Sass partial to go and edit to modify that. Next thing it does is compile the CSS, one small step in the compiling of CSS process. Then it runs through using a post-CSS plugin, which you configure and you define which versions of which browsers you'd care to be supporting in your file. And we'll actually go and look up what vendor prefixes it needs to add to your CSS3 declarations and adds them on the fly. So this is really nice because you don't need to think about vendor prefixes ever again. You just write the CSS3 spec, 2 spec declarations, and then we'll go ahead and add in all the vendor prefixes you need automatically. based off of, you say I want to support IE 10, 11, 12, whatever, and then it will go ahead and add in only the prefixes that are needed. Then it nags at you for your file size. If your CSS gets too big, it will complain at you. And then finally, it runs the linter and makes sure that the file you just saved adheres to the coding conventions within the project. Another big part of what we're doing these days with our front-end development is SVGs. So scalar vector graphics is a sort of XML-ish kind of format for defining vector images. SVGs are awesome because they're resolution independent, and we tend to use them mostly for icon systems these days. They are, in my opinion, clearly superior to icon font-based approaches where you kind of compile a font out of it, primarily because you can control the color of the icons in SVG with CSS alone, which you can do with the icon fonts too, but you can actually have multiple colors in one icon controlled with CSS rather than just one color, which would be an icon font. The second thing is, I think at the end of the day, icons, there's semantic reasons and accessibility reasons that SVGs are better, because you can actually put in accessible tags right inside of your SVGs. So there's really two components in Mainspring that are related to how we deal with icon fonts. And the first is the ability to control their color with CSS. The second is the ability to sprite icons. And what this is you've got an SVG file, which is like a small little graphic that represents one icon. And what you can do is you can actually take the content of that file, wrap it in what's called a symbol tag, and put them into a new SVG file. And you can do this over and over again, where you take all your little icons and copy them and wrap them in a symbol tag and put them in another svgSprite. And what that will make one giant file, so we got fewer requests with all the graphics embedded in that one file, and it doesn't actually render anything. You've defined it as a symbol. And then you can use, just straight in HTML, you can see this Sprite Social SVG, hashtag Facebook. So there is a symbol with the ID of Facebook, and that will actually render out that one icon right in there as a native SVG. And if you notice, these are actually external files. So you make one SVG with all these external files in it, it gets cached by the browser, and it allows you to very efficiently use your SVG, which this can also be affected by CSS color if you do a couple tricks to make sure it's done right. So let's take a look at the SVG task. And this one's one of the more complicated ones. So the first step is when you run Gulp svgSprite, it goes to your output folder and deletes everything, because we want to make sure that there's no garbage in there. That if you ended up deleting an icon from your set or renaming it, it goes in. That guarantees that it doesn't make it into your sprite. Second thing it does is it goes into your SVG source folder, and it actually looks for folders inside of there, and then it looks for sprites inside of those folders. So for this example, let's just say there's a folder called my-sprite sitting inside of there. It does a process where it minifies the sprites and deletes stroke and fill attributes, which are SVG attributes. And the reason it does it is if you have stroke and fill attributes in your SVG, you cannot manipulate its color in CSS. But if you delete them, then it goes to default color, and you can actually start defining the colors in CSS alone. And then it copies from SVG source MySprite, copies those optimized and decolorized files into the output folder SVG MySprite. Then, as the next step, is it takes all the SVGs, the small SVG partials that are sitting in SVG/MySprite, automatically does that symbol tag thing I described earlier, and makes a MySprite folder. So pretty complicated, but let's look at the end result of this. We've got an SVG, one Gulp svgSprite task, where if I want to make a sprite in my project, I make a folder called, MySprite. I put a bunch of sprites, a bunch of SVG icons in there, run this task once, and now I've got, at the end of the day, I've got a sprite output of minified, ready to go, externally loaded sprites. Say my project has like a logged in user area and a public user area. it might not make sense to dump all of those icons into one humongous sprite because maybe many users are only on the front end and many users are on the back end. So say I need to add a second sprite into it, I just make a new folder called, whatever, user area, user sprite, put a bunch of icons in there, run the task again, and I've automatically now got 2 different sprites that I could call independently inside of my project. So it's a really good way to manage icon fonts. As an aside, this topic of doing SVG sprites and all that, in the Sass meetup, I've got like a 2.5 hour long workshop that we'd go through to talk about all these different things. So I've got the link there that's pointing to the Sass meetup text on. Basically, you can go through this in step to step if you're not familiar with how to do SVG spriting and how to control SVGs, how to control their color with CSS. Next tool in the sort of bundle of Node Gulp tools in there is called Browser Sync. Browser Sync is awesome. It is a tool which runs a proxy server inside of your local development environment. And what it does is it allows all your different devices to connect up to your computer, and they all kind of follow along. So if you start scrolling around on the mobile phone inside of there, all the browsers that are there will start scrolling around. If you click on something, all of them will go to that same page. So that's incredibly useful for debugging. This is a bit of a contrived example. I wouldn't actually normally do this. I just wanted to see how many we could get working at once. But normally when I'm developing, I will have like a phone that's iOS and a tablet that's Android, and maybe run a VM with an IE on a screen, like a separate screen or whatever. And so just by covering, form factors and platforms is kind of a good idea while you're working, because it's way easier to fix bugs as you're authoring things in other browsers than it is to go through a QA process and then get the bug reported and then fix them later, right? Like that takes way more time. The other thing that Browser Sync does that's really useful once we combine with these Gulp tasks is that when properly tuned with the Gulp tasks, I can get it so that when I save a file and it runs, say, the CSS compile task I was talking about before, it will automatically refresh the browser for all the connected devices. And what's cool is if only CSS changes, Browser Sync is smart enough to not refresh the whole page. It just pipes new CSS and refreshes the screen. So if you're at the bottom of a page or something like that, right, you don't get that refresh that puts you up to the top of the page and you have to scroll down again. So every little optimization helps, right? Like saving a second or two 100 times a day it starts to add up over time. So let's take all these pieces of the puzzle and put them together. And so this is really the Gulp watch task, which is kind of like, you can also just run Gulp and it's the default task for what we've got inside of here. And what this does, so this is development mode. And basically it sits there and it sets up and it waits for you to save something inside of your Sass folder. Then it runs the compile CSS task. It renders a style guide automatically at the same time, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Refreshes your browser and links the Sass file you just saved. So you can see how we're doing a lot of stuff automatically every time you save. But what's really awesome about Gulp is that it's asynchronous tasks. So basically some of these tasks, like compiling the style guide on this crappy ancient laptop, takes like 5 seconds. So that might be kind of annoying if you're not even working on the style guide, you're working on the front end of your website. But because Gulp is asynchronous, the CSS compile would probably be like 1 second or 2 seconds, and they run at the same time. So you're not actually like waiting for all of these things to finish and then it refreshes the browser. The CSS refreshes the browser and the generate the style guide refreshes the browser. So whichever happens to happen later, it will automatically refresh for you. So Gulp is a really awesome tool. So, just going to talk a little bit about naming patterns and sort of CSS architecture. SMACT is kind of I guess, the granddaddy of these approaches, scalable and modular architecture for CSS, made by Jonathan Snook. Another one you might have heard of is called BEM, Block Element Modifier. And basically, these two naming pattern conventions have been blended together into the Drupal 8 CSS coding standards. And so really, it's important to, as a team, have standards on how you ought to name and structure things. And it's important to have those expressed somewhere so you can understand them and teach new team members how they work. So Mainspring is based off of the Drupal 8 coding standards and extended a little bit. But the principles of the Drupal 8 coding standards are very important. We want to make sure that it's predictable so that you have consistent, understandable code so that unexpected changes, when you change something, you know what you're changing and you don't accidentally affect other components. You need to make sure that they're reusable, so I can take a little widget in my UI. If I've solved the problem, I can use it somewhere else without having to redo a bunch of work. Need to make sure that it's maintainable, so it's easy to add and modify and change things inside of my project, and scalable. So the coding conventions need to work for me when I'm working on by myself on a project, or when I have a larger team all working at the same time. So talking about, this is an example of BEM, and again, the naming things topic is actually probably a huge talk on its own, so I'm just going to gloss over this. But we've got block, element, and modifier. So in Drupal world, block is a confusing word to use, so we call it a component instead. And so you can see there we've got a site search component, site search _field. So just from the naming convention there, you can kind of understand that whatever's got that class on it is kind of like a child piece of the site search component itself. And then double hyphen means modifier. So site search _full means it's kind of like a variation of the default site search component so full might be like, it's got an expanded display view with some, I don't know, optional filters or something like that you might add into that example. So this is what we've got as our folder structure inside of the Sass folders for Mainspring. We use slightly different folders than the Drupal 8. Drupal 8 sort of SMACS-based folders is how the Drupal 8 coding standards work. We've got globals, components, layouts, utility, and vendor. So inside of globals, what we do is we make all of our partials. The first thing that we do inside of that's a little different than the Drupal 8 ones is we put sort of like Hungarian notation prefixes on all of our classes. So you can see all the partial elements that are inside of the global folder start with a G, and that would be probably an underscore on the first one there. That's a little typo, but you can see, so global elements are the default elements that you would expect a content contributor who is using your website at the end of the day to be able to fill out in a WYSIWYG. So the actual default HTML elements are a good example of global items. You might have functions or mix-ins that you use site-wide across your projects. So typography variations, default table displays, meaning you put a table in a WYSIWYG or something like that, or you generate a table using a Drupal module, or like scalar vector graphics. Next section is components. So again, this is identical to Drupal 8 coding standards now, except that we prefix all of our components with a C- prefix on there. So you might have buttons. There's a button variation that's small. Cards, the sort of Google idea of using cards as like a data, as a user interface component. Accordions or menus. Layouts. So again, we prefix our layouts with L. Layouts are the items that will position the components on a page. So you might have a layout that controls the overall page size. You might have a layout for the header that takes a nav menu, and when the screen's wider, it pops it in a horizontal bar across the top, and when it's smaller, you might have like a mobile display. We also have reusable layouts. So like a L-2 is a 2-column layout. L-4 might be a 4-column layout. Utility functions. So these functions are kind of for the classes and items that don't neatly fit in the 3 other sections. Utilities are useful for things like clear fix, We've got a utility text hide, so that visually hides text from the display but leaves it available for screen readers. So if you're going to do like an icon button, you want to, that's a picture of Facebook, it should say like on Facebook or follow on Facebook or whatever, and then you just hide the text visually so that a screen reader would still be able to access it, or resetting a list, getting rid of the dots or something like that inside of there. What's important is that u-clearfix, the utility components do kind of one job and one job alone, because they're basically you can use them across your site for things like clearfix and really kind of utility functions. And then the last folder is vendor. So vendor is when we are using third-party libraries and we were too lazy to refactor the code into our own standards. So you put, say jQuery UI, it's got a bunch of CSS in there. You just rename it SCSS and dump it in the vendors folder and include it. And that way, with the advantage of doing that, and you're probably going to hack it to your own purposes, but the Sass linter ignores whatever's in a vendor folder, so it doesn't nag at you for those conventions. We actually also, if modules produce CSS, pretty typically we'll actually use the theme info file to stop that CSS from coming through and copy it out into our vendor folder, because there's probably a whole bunch of stuff we don't want in there, or naming conventions that we don't actually want to have in our project. And so we can kind of optimize things a little bit by controlling it ourselves. But really, if you start using something seriously, you should probably refactor it and put it in a component and re-engineer it to what lines up with the rest of your project. So this is all very abstract and difficult to understand. So I've got a couple examples in here. Basically, this is like a creative comp for a website we put together for Enercare. It's an Ontario utility. And so we identify the components on the creative. So we got a main menu component, a masthead component, and actions. So each one of those things we call an action because we wanted people to click on it. And so the next step is we start naming. We make a folder for each of these items, c-nav, and put it in the components folder. And inside of that folder, we've got cnav main.scss. Next one would be a folder called cmasthead with cmasthead.scss inside of it, and caction folder with caction.scss and caction verticals. So that's an example where this component had all kinds of variations. There was like a horizontal one with and without icons and all this stuff. So if we put all of the variations of that particular component into one file, it would get too long. And you wouldn't be able to grok the file all at once as a developer. So we break it up into smaller individual files once things get a little bit more complicated. Just a quick example of what a layout might look like to bring it into pictures. The HTML, or sorry, the CSS that takes an action component when it's narrow on a small display and puts it into 2 columns when it's wider is an example of a layout. And I've got another example here where we can start sort of seeing, again, how we think about, we've got creative comp, we've gone probably through wireframing exercise or whatever, and now we've got some approved creative. What do we do when we start off to code? We start drawing boxes on things. So these are the global elements. So we've got typography H1, H2, and then a generic class like gtype large variation in there. These are the components we've identified: logo, main nav, secondary nav, something we're calling highlights, and a button at the bottom there. And then these are our layouts. So we're figuring out the containers, the objects that start controlling and affecting how all the components inside of them look. So header logo, in this case the nav disappears and turns into a mobile nav. This is a variation of our header content that's got it centered because most of the text in this website was left aligned, but a few big caption things were centered, and the content area below. So when we're done, and you turn them all on, you can basically see every little piece of that comp is wrapped in something and defined. So we are thinking and naming our CSS partials after the user interface components. We do not name things after whether they came out of views or what rendered them or whatever. We name them after the interface itself and make sure that as a team, like this is an exercise we go through and sort of naming everything and decide, yeah, is this a global thing or is this a component or whatever? And it needs a little bit of debate when you're working through a project to sort of think through that. Why do we do this obsessive naming convention pattern system that is pretty detailed? Well, I can inspect this website now that it's done, and I can tell you which folder I need to go to change any element that's in there and which file in that folder just by inspecting the HTML and seeing the class name. So we end up with this super verbose, like one class name per pretty much everything in your CSS structure, but it has a pretty distinct advantage of being able to have direct parity between the user interface components and the code that builds the website itself. Another cool benefit of using the sort of Hungarian notation naming conventions, and so this is, and I forgot to mention, it's Harry Roberts, he sort of did a blog post on how to, he sort of inspired this idea. Basically, we borrowed half of it and implemented in the Drupal coding standards. And this is a major benefit. If your IDE or code text editor has code hinting, you can just start typing and it will outline and suggest all of the components or whatever globals that you've actually defined in your project. So this is yet another tool to help not forget about something you've already built inside of your project. Another side effect and thought about why this structure has a benefit as well is while our project is taking all of this in the Gulp Sass task is compiling a CSS file, at the same time, all those partials are structured in a way that generates a style guide from the same code base itself. The style guide we like to use is called SC5. It is friggin' awesome. It is built on top of Node KSS Node, which is a very, I think in the Drupal world, is probably the most popular style guide generator. So it's just, it has that as a dependency and then layers some cool features on top. It is an Angular app, so I guess I do Angular sort of now. Not really, but it is an Angular app. And what's really, really important when you're working with it, especially in like live edit developer mode or whatever, is that you disable your browser's cache when it's like live updating and re-rendering like JSON files that are involved in this in the style guide itself, because some really strange things can happen when you have caching turned on. You're like, why is it not there? And I've personally done that many times, so just make sure you kill your cache. So if you want to check out the output of that style guide, we've got a little just demo site up there. But because I was hoping to record this, I pre-recorded some video of what the output this is the vanilla output from Mainspring. There are a whole bunch of components and buttons and sections inside of there, just with some default styling to really, again, this is for us to have enough in there so that as we evolve a project, there's enough examples in there so you can start with something and see it in context. So this is the button component where you can see all the different button variations that are in there. SC5 has a really cool feature that's not a KSS node feature, where we're asking for variations that are hover links and other pseudo classes, and it actually generates flat CSS styles of those pseudo classes so that you can see them without actually having to hover over the button and stuff like that. So that's a really cool feature that's in there. You can see the Sass source file that's in there, which is, so you can see the Sass that actually renders the output inside of that. And then it has this other little thing where there's little X's on every component, and that's isolation mode. So you can like pop open just one piece of your components and view them on their own. So sometimes you have like complex layouts or that kind of thing in a style guide, and like the frame of the style guide kind of interferes with you testing it or seeing it. So if you have something like that in your style guide, you can just go into isolation mode and it's on there by itself. Another really cool thing about isolation mode is if you're into visual regression testing, you can visually regression test just individual components like on their own inside inside an expanded view. So another neat feature that's in there, it's got this search box. Are we gonna? There we are. Yeah. So you can just start typing the names of components. So I typed in tabs. You can see there, changed it to tables. It's refreshed there. So just a really useful search function that as your style guide gets longer and more complicated, it's a good way to find things quickly. And then finally, there is a neat function related to variables. So I'm hopping into the global colors section. The example only is black and white, so it's not that complicated. But on the right there's this tab that opens up, and it's showing the Sass variables that are being used in the component I happen to be looking at right now. So that's really cool. It's saying, black and white are defined as variables. Now I've hit this Show All Variables button, and now it's showing all the variables that I'm using in my Sass partials, and I can actually highlight it. So there's a base font size variable, and I can click on it, and now it's showing which components in my style guide are actually implementing that particular variable. So it's really useful for you're using a variable and you want to make sure that a couple different pieces of your website all respect the same variable. It's an easy way to navigate and explore that. So how do we make style guide, how do we generate that website? Well, basically it's using KSS notation, which is what we're seeing here. This is a comment that appears in your SCSS file. And so basically this piece, this comment we're seeing here, would generate this whole component on the left-hand side. So that button component with all of its variations. And so KSS notation is really finicky. I don't actually love it, but but the output of it is so awesome that it's worth sort of putting up with. Basically, the first line of your comment becomes the title that shows up in the component. The last line of your comment must be keyword style guide space number point number, at least in SC5. In KSS Node, there's a naming pattern convention that works, but that feature for some reason doesn't work in SC5. And so that both creates the menu and makes the hierarchy of all your components inside of the website, and obviously and controls the order of all the different sections in that. Then there's a keyword markup colon, and so all this has to be exactly right, and the white spaces between them must be exactly right for this to all work, which is why I think it's a little bit finicky, but it does the job. That is that link tag, which is inside of there, that generates kind of the buttons that appear there. And then this last component is the modifier special tag. So this is a special variable that is called modifiers. And what it's doing is it looks through this list of items, and again, the white space around them and the fact that they have hyphens defines that they're modifiers, which I think is a little bit weird, but whatever. And what it does is for each one of these modifiers, it's generated a separate example button, where I said C button with a hover, C button with the blue variation, C button blue with the hover, and so on. So that basically the KSS will go through and generate one example per item inside of there, and then list them out at the top of the page. So another sort of cool feature in SC5 that I think is really useful is, again, sometimes our style guide components, like an accordion or certain reasonably complicated elements, the actual HTML of them is kind of long. You might have 20 lines of HTML in a really complicated example. And so the first thing, and this is a KSS Node native feature, is you can reference an external HTML file instead of actually putting all the HTML in your Sass partial. So I think that that's a really useful, to keep the Sass partials clean and easy to read. If you have, if it's more than 5 lines, I'll probably put it in an external file. That goes into the same folder that we put the component in as well. And then there is an SC5 feature that is really, really useful. So this is SC5 only. SG insert, so I guess it's style guide insert. It's got its own special tag where you just reference the number of the component and it goes and it loads that other guy's example and pastes it right inside of there. So that's really useful because in this case we've got an accordion example and one instance of an accordion panel, and we don't want to have to maintain that in two places. You know, this is showing 3 accordion tabs, and so 7.21 is on the left there, so that's an open expanded accordion, and then 7.2 was the collapsed one. So you can just reference the other style guide number. It will go and dynamically insert those examples inside of here, so it's easier for maintenance, right? If you change that core component, you don't need to remember to go and change it into the example with 3 of them, and the example with 1. You can just change it in one place. So we have a lot of advantages from using all of these tools in place. Our teams are able to work faster, hopefully have fewer bugs in making it into QA, at least from an optimization point of view. That's certainly going to happen. It encourages making recyclable and recyclable and reusable components, and our performance optimizations are easier to do. And it's really quite a pain in the ass to set up all this stuff. So that's why we made Mainspring, so that hopefully you can see working examples of it, take the whole thing, borrow a little piece of it, whatever you want. And all I can recommend is if you're looking at this and you think it's a bit overwhelming, it certainly is. It still is for me too, as we're trying to learn and expand on our basic tooling sets. So I just say take it in baby steps. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
I have 2 questions. The first one is there any tool that can create for you the whole structure for the CSS files, like the one that you described with components, layouts, etc., etc.?
So there's no tool right now. If you download Mainspring, there's a whole bunch of default components that are basically unstyled. So if you think about like Twitter Bootstrap or Foundation Zerb, they've got like a huge pre-styled, ready-to-go style guide. This is like a vanilla, unstyled version of that. So if you download Mainspring and take a peek in there, that's all set up in there. As I was saying before, in the future, I think something like a human template generator, which is basically, it's kind of like Drupal console or whatever. Like it's a tool where you'd be like, install Mainspring, and then it'd be like, do you want the Drupal stuff? Yes or no. Do you want to use, like basically ask a few questions and then scaffold all those pieces out. But for now, just got to go and download the zip and see what's in the folder structure there.
Like on the style guides, is there a generator that can pick up only the CSS file already compiled and then generate the style guide out of that instead of going through this process?
There are style guide generators that work off of compiled CSS. So at the end of the day, the style guide generators are looking for comments. So that's actually what KSS Node, I assume KSS Node would work with CSS. I don't actually know. With CSS native instead of Sass. But I know that many style guide generators are actually designed to just do CSS comments as well.
Do you have an example of that?
So I'm pretty sure Hologram, and I think KSS is actually able to just parse native CSS. So SC5 probably not, but KSS Node, it's worth taking a look at and seeing if it does on its own. Doesn't have all of the features though. So it makes the style guide though, which is awesome, and we used KSS Node for in the past. So it's definitely an awesome package. Yeah.
Do you only mainly use this package with Drupal, or use it with different?
You could use it with anything. There's actually we were thinking of putting a few Drupal templates in there so that you could at least be like, okay, like page layout, and just put some classes on it so you kind of get the context of it. But there's actually, it would be perfectly fine for anything that runs, I guess, compiled HTML and CSS. So like an Angular app, maybe not, but other than that, WordPress or whatever would be fine.
Why did you choose Gulp, like compared to Grunt?
So Gulp can run asynchronously, and I don't think Grunt's there yet. Also, Gulp has many, it's designed to be little modular packages that get glued together. So Gulp is more flexible. It's harder to, I feel it's harder to get working, harder to kind of understand. But once you have that all working, being able to say these two tasks, so the lint task and the compile task, there's no codependency there. The linter goes off and runs in its own memory stream, and the compiler goes off and runs in a different memory stream. So probably want to run on an SSD because it's going to be watching thousands of files potentially and recompiling things frequently. But basically, Gulp is superior to Grunt for performance. And we're doing tons and tons of tasks on that watch, so performance really matters.
But the learning curve is high.
I guess that's an opinion thing. If you're used to JavaScript stuff, or I think Gulp would probably be easier. But Grunt allows, basically it's got big configuration arrays, and so that's kind of, I found it kind of easier to get started in Grunt, but just the performance, like, learn Gulp. I know that the Grunt folks, though, I think are working on the same thing where they can do asynchronous tasks, but I haven't heard about that actually hitting deployment yet, and Gulp started that way. So no matter what in that performance race, Gulp's probably going to be faster for quite a while. Yeah?
How do you manage your version control inside your theme folder?
So we just unzip the file, dump it in there, and then our Drupal project has that in Git. What we tend to use Pantheon or GitHub for our projects.
But I mean, what do you exclude? What part of the bundle do you exclude?
Oh, so there's a git ignore inside of there that's going to ignore, basically the node modules folder and the Gulp components that are in there, because that's why we also copy out the JavaScript that are installed with Bower. It gets copied into the JavaScript folder, so we consider that, if your website needs it to run, it needs to get copied out of those default install places and put into your project. Bower components, sometimes we commit them to the repo, sometimes we don't. Really, you only need the Bower components folder for Sass tools that are in there, so like our grid system and that we like to use in a couple, like a breakpoint mixin and stuff like that, that are we use on 100% of our projects. So sometimes it makes sense to commit them, but I mean, it's basically, you just, whatever's needed to run your website gets committed, and then everything else should probably just be a local install. Yeah.
I was just wondering how big your team is and how long it took you to get efficient with the Mainspring.
Right, so our team is 4, and so this has been 2.5 years of slow evolution to get to this point. We started off using Sass and having a really hard time trying to figure out how to learn it. I saw like John Album's talk on Sass and like how he broke everything down into partials, and we paused the video and like look at his naming conventions and be like, oh, okay, that's how he's naming stuff. So that kind of process was sort of the first iteration, and we used Ruby-based Compass and Grunt, and then switched over to Gulp, and now we've gotten rid of all of the Ruby dependencies, so now it's all just Node, and it runs so much faster now that it's all just Node. It was just, forgot to mention, yes, if you are compiling your Sass with Ruby Sass, just stop doing that and switch over to libsass. It's 10 times faster. And it used to be like a few years ago, Ruby Sass had newer, better features than Gulp Sass, but it no longer does. The projects are now in parity for features, and the maintainers have said that they're going to keep them in parity for all of the future. So yeah, if you're not, definitely switch to Node Sass. Yeah?
Hi, actually 2 questions. What was that alternative to Ruby you just mentioned for Sass there?
libsass. So this is Gulp Sass is the actual module, but which runs Node Sass, which runs libsass. Node world is confusing.
And I had a question about for responsive, like all the breakpoints, media queries. Where in that sort of folder structure for a CSS file where does that get placed?
So I consider those global things. So there's actually two. That's a complicated sort of issue. We do for certain components they should be flexible and be able to fit inside of a container. So we have global breakpoints which sit in global, and then when it comes to components getting arranged in a layout, we actually use a JavaScript library called EQJS, which does an element query, which is kind of a missing piece of the holy grail of responsive design where you don't actually want your layouts to change the width of the browser. You want your layouts to change the width of the container that the objects are in. And so that's Sam Richards' JavaScript library, Snugug. We use it on every single project. And so certain components that have layouts will actually, they'll control their own layouts inside of their components folder. And this is a little bit confusing, like where a component ends and a layout begins and a global, like this is a metaphysical question, like it's not clear cut. So if a component is unique and its layout is unique to it and could not be recycled anywhere else, probably put it in the component itself. But breakpoints that change, media query based breakpoints, we put them in global.
Do you train your designer to do the style guide?
So it's in the queue. Basically, I was like, we're now at the point where we should be at the beginning of a project, we're designing in the style guide. So we're making like HTML pieces. Our design process usually starts with, a comp exploration, wireframes and comp exploration at the same time. And at some point we get a style tile, so just a little representation of lots of different pieces of the element of the website. And then we can start actual development, right? And take those style tiles and just build the little pieces in the style guide. There's no Drupal website yet, or it's Stark, theme or whatever. And then we'll work on those individual pieces and work with the designer and be like, how does this feel to you? We start stretching it, being like, okay, now we're pushing the limits of what the design intent was. What should we do here? And kind of have a conversation about how to take that direction. But I definitely want to get to the next level where the default things that come out of Mainspring, so like titles and typography, really basic elements that we're going to use over and over again, he gets up to the point where he's comfortable just, adjusting color variables and size variables to control those elements.
And is he comfortable right now? Like
No.
he's taking-
No. It's in the queue, so but I didn't even mention it. SC5 has this idea of using its own internal server, and it's got this whole tool in there that does inside of the style guide. They can hack the style outputs and actually live edit the tools. It's kind of scary to me, so I was like, well, nah. That's like the WordPress upgrade your modules button. I'm like, or your plugins. I'm like, nah, no thanks. Yeah.
How do you find that? Well, it seems like you've got a really clear-cut line in your team, and between the back-end team and the front-end team. And how do you find the adoption of this work method? Has affected the openness or the ease?
Yeah.
Has your code become impenetrable to everyone, but before on your front-end team?
Well,
what has it done?
This is super documented, right? So if you go into the style guide, this is like the overview of the global section says, these are the patterns for globals, and globals are these kinds of things. And at least it's got a structure that is available and transparent. Part of the problem is we went down this road and actually engineered this whole system, and only we knew about it. And like some of us would know some of it, and some of us would know the rest of it. And we'd forget, like there's cool mix-ins to like make an SVG graphic icon and position it in line with a piece of text, right? Like I spent forever writing this stupid mix-in that like does this positioning trick. And I'd go through the code reviews of the other guys and I'm like, why did you not just use the mix-in, right? And so it got to the point where we realized every Sass partial inside of your file structure needs a style guide page. And even if the style guide page says, here is this thing that does this, like, you don't even take the time to properly document it, just having something in there is much more helpful than somewhere deep in the thousands of Sass partials inside of your folder, there is a cool mix-in, right? At least if you're like, check out this cool mix-in for SVG, there's a chance you will remember to do that. And that's really part of the effort, is to make sure that we maintain awareness of all the work we've done as much as is possible. Yeah.
You said that you are a team of 4 and you had problems understanding this whole thing.
Yeah.
If you were like a freelancer, would you switch to that? Like, for example, I know Sass, I know Gulp,
Right.
all these tools, and would you say, okay, just try this and jump in it and you will get used to it? Or I mean, like the learning curve is like this.
So there's the three distinct pieces, right? Style guide, CSS architecture, and Gulp tasks. So it depends on where you're at, right? The one part that is probably the least transferable between teams is we got a pretty strong opinion about how to name and structure our Sass and CSS. So that's the first place where you're like, hey, let's just use Drupal 8 coding standards, or let's use object-oriented CSS, or let's use Smack's native. Like, definitely just throw out the CSS structure that we're using, but definitely consider Living Style Guide and Gulp to automate things, right? So you can just pick and choose whatever piece makes most sense to you. The naming conventions that we evolved to this from doing Smack's BEM hybrid, and it became very confusing about where to put the layouts, whether this is a component or not. So we feel that the global and the utility being two pieces that kind of replace in Drupal 8 coding standards. There's a config folder, and then I forget the other one. But anyway, we replaced those, and it feels less ambiguous to us. But that's like feels less ambiguous to us. So whatever feels better for you and your team is definitely what I'd recommend doing. Just update the Sass linter so it nags at you when you do something other than exactly what you think your standard should be, so that it's consistent across. Even if you're freelance, right? Like a year-old project is way easier to dive into if it, the exact order that properties appear in inside of a CSS declaration. If it's always exactly the same, it takes way less time to comprehend your old work, and so that's really a really useful piece of the puzzle. All right, it's lunchtime. Thank you.